Welcome back to the EP Squared podcast. Today, we are exploring Brazil's fiscal and monetary policy over the last two political cycles from Jair Bolsonaro's term starting in 2019 through Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's term. At the end, we'll give our thoughts on how we think the economy is doing and what we think can change.
Starting things off, what was Brazil's policy approach entering Bolsonaro's term and during COVID-19?
In 2019, the country elected Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right populist focused on limiting government spending and power, while also supporting common people through his policies.
Focusing first on fiscal policy, Bolsonaro reinforced keeping public spending low. Brazil had already implemented a public spending cap, the Teto de Gastos, in 2016, so Bolsonaro mainly needed to keep it running.
His ultimate goal was to reduce the public deficit relative to GDP. In 2019, he dropped the deficit by 1.3%, exceeding his goal by over 40 billion BRL.
On monetary policy, the Central Bank of Brazil cut the Selic, or average interest rate, to 4.5% to support economic activity. Lower interest rates encouraged investment, but also encouraged inflation.
Then COVID-19 hit in 2020, forcing Bolsonaro to relax fiscal rules. Large stimulus measures supported employment, health, social assistance, and businesses, substantially increasing public expenditures beyond the spending cap.
Total government purchases rose to 3.49 trillion BRL, 46% of GDP, almost half a trillion more than 2019.
Monetary policy remained largely the same. The BCB cut the Selic to an all-time low of 2%, again targeting liquidity and economic activity, which also contributed to rising inflation.
Jumping forward, what happened as this inflation surged and the 2022 elections approached?
In 2021, consumer inflation rose above 10%, the highest in 6 years. The BCB aggressively raised the Selic from 2% early in the year to higher levels to curb inflation, while the economy still grew roughly 4.8%.
Pandemic-related fiscal spending continued, including the Auxílio Brasil program, which replaced Bolsa Familia, providing cash transfers and supporting education and health infrastructure.
In 2022, fiscal policy shifted toward election year measures like tax waivers and increased social benefits. Congress approved a package suspending parts of the spending cap to boost these benefits.
Meanwhile, the BCB continued tightening monetary policy to counter inflation, raising the Selic towards historically restrictive levels by year-end.
So what changed under President Lula's first 2 years in office?
Well, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was elected president in 2023 through a strong populist campaign, focusing on social inclusion for the impoverished.
Firstly, Lula replaced the hard cap system of the Teto de Gastos with the Arcabouco Fiscal, and a system built on three key pillars.
The first was that government spending could only grow by 70% of the increase in tax revenue. And secondly, overall spending had to grow at least 0.6, but no more than 2.5% per year.
These rules ensured that after a bad year, spending would grow enough to maintain public services, and after a good year, it would not create a spending bubble.
The Arcabouco Fiscal also ensured that the government would bring in more tax revenue than its initial spending, using the remainder for debt interest. This aimed to balance fiscal consolidation with social spending needs.
In the second year, 2024, the government found it difficult to navigate the system while meeting social and mandatory expenditures. The IMF also noted that GDP growth might not keep pace with national debt growth, suggesting that some funds might need to be diverted from social programs to reduce debt.
Partly because of the IMF report and a desire for more fiscal flexibility, President Lula passed tax policies benefiting the working class while taxing the wealthy. This included a 12% tax on online operators and 15% on winnings, and 20% imported tax on international e-commerce, and banning deferred funds in foreign accounts or private investment funds.
Now, moving on into 2025, what were the key developments in policy that year?
In terms of fiscal policy, the government had a goal of having a primary deficit of zero, the spending and tax revenue equaling each other.
However, when higher than expected tax revenues came in, the government chose to fund social programs instead of paying off more of the national debt.
The Congress also rejected President Lula's financial transaction tax increase, which was a tool intended to boost revenue and reduce the need for expenditure cuts as more money would allow for the more programs to occur and the debt to decrease. However, the Congress still passed a bill which would increase the taxes on the rich while giving a Brazilian dollar 5,000 exemption for workers.
Throughout Lula's presidency, the BCB continued to keep the Selic rate high to fight inflation, maintaining a strong conservative stance through Lula's actions. Brazil has faced many challenges and significant economic changes over the past two political cycles. So, if we are policymakers, what would we do? It is easy to look at Brazil's budget deficit and immediately suggest that the government cut spending and to keep the Selic rate high. However, we believe a different approach would be more effective.
As we discussed earlier, Brazil's economy is constrained by a lack of infrastructure. The country still relies heavily on its agricultural sector and has not developed the level of transportation, logistics, and energy infrastructure seen in many other major economies. Logistics costs remain extremely high relative to other developed nations. As a result, Brazil's potential GDP remains limited and poverty levels remain relatively high. To address this, we advocate for increased infrastructure and investment spending by both the government and corporations.
First, we would modify the Arcabuco fiscal framework to give the government slightly more flexibility in using tax revenue to promote economic growth. Increased government investment in infrastructure would allow Brazil to dedicate more resources to physical capital and the development of technologies, which historically produce strong economic multipliers. Studies from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund suggest that infrastructure investment in emerging markets can generate multipliers between 1.5 and 2, meaning each real spent by the government could increase GDP by significantly more than the initial investment. Because these investments focus on infrastructure rather than temporary social transfers, they also increase productivity and reduce production costs for businesses. Over time, this would shift the aggregate supply curve to the right, along with the aggregate demand curve, which shifted earlier, allowing growth and price stability.
Additionally, we would focus on improving Brazil's tax system. Because Brazil currently operates with persistent deficits, maintaining sufficient tax revenue is necessary to support its debt relative to GDP. However, Brazil also has one of the most complex tax systems in the world, which increases administrative costs for businesses and discourages investment.
In terms of monetary policy, the Central Bank of Brazil has taken a very aggressive approach to fighting inflation, and this overall strategy has been somewhat effective. With the Selic rate currently around 15%, borrowing costs in Brazil are among the highest in major economies, and this is a problem. We recommend that the central bank monitor inflation and alter the Selic rate as such, then maintain one consistent stance. In the first few years of increased infrastructure spending and encourage investment, we recommend keeping the Selic rate lower to help bolster the movement towards a more productive economy. High Selic rates have been noticed as a consistent cause to Brazil's economic stagnation. Lower interest rates would also help stimulate economic growth by encouraging business investment, consumer borrowing, and housing development. However, once projects are underway and productivity boosts, we recommend the central bank re-implement a conservative stance, maintaining restrictive policies to fight inflation to a degree through small, predictable increments of the Selic rate, such as 25 to 50 basis points at a time.
Investing in infrastructure, simplifying the tax system, and encouraging investment, the government can boost productivity, expand the economy, and strengthen long-term fiscal stability. Together, these policies can create a better Brazil, and that's our take.